Thank you. Good evening, commissioners. Good evening to members of the Barbados Labour Party. I want to say thank you for giving us this opportunity to explore, because I do consider this still an exploration of some of these ideas. We, as the first vice chair has indicated, we thought that in order to frame our responses, we would approach the questions provided, the 35 questions, by structuring them thematically. What we did find it useful to do in that regard was to consider the question of financing of political parties and financing of election campaigns and everything associated with the operation of political parties, together with the conversation about the questions that dealt with terms and conditions for parliamentarians and so on. And why is that? I think that we, as a country, are mature enough to be able to appreciate that there's a cost to democracy. There is a cost to governance. And everything that we are called to do in order to make sure that people have a vote, that people have a voice, and that people are included in governance means that we have to bear that cost together. Therefore, we considered that the question of campaign finance, and as some people frame it, campaign finance reform, it will be one of those issues, commissioners, that we do a little bit more research on, look at what happens in other jurisdictions and have a written response for you. But we consider that those things have to be considered together. How do you finance committees of parliament in order to strengthen our democracy? Understanding that this is important work. How do you finance political parties? And this, of course, is linked to the question of registration. Because obviously, if you're going to finance a political party, there has to be some threshold, there has to be some trigger where one considers that a political party may receive financing when certain conditions are met. And what is the purpose of that financing? Now, we have had several conversations about the question of the Auditor General. We have had several conversations about members of parliament and therefore members of cabinet being able to operate with a certain level of independence in the affairs of the state. We consider that for true independence to take place in that regard, that there has to be some separation of the fundraising or of the way that elections are fundraised for and financed. That means that members of parliament, in keeping perhaps with a new code of ethics to which they swear, would not then depend on private interests solely in order to finance election campaigns. We think that this is in the interest of the people of Barbados to have the assurance that there's a certain independence in this regard. And so we expect to very quickly put something together with respect to campaign finance to look at this question of financing governance in Barbados, because we have put it all under that particular rubric. The other consideration that we made has to do with not so much specific terms and conditions of parliamentarians, although we do believe that there's room to consider whether these terms and conditions allow MPs to function at their best, and further to that, whether it allows the country to attract the quality of MPs that Barbadians have come to rely on. I think this is a very loaded issue and there's a lot to say on it. All I will say at this point is that it is very important to me, coming from where I have come from. I think the member who is at the podium will agree, coming from where he has come from, that children of poor people can come to political service. If we continue to have a situation, or if we have a situation, which we historically had, where only those who happen to come with generational wealth that they then use in order to be able to have political success. If only those people are allowed to come to political service, then that is not democracy. And so whatever system we come up with, we have to find a way that any Barbadian, no matter the circumstances of their birth, can represent people if that is the will of the people. So I would just give those framing words, and then I think we can come with a written submission. Thanks so much. The question really is, it's exactly as you say, Madam Chairperson. I made a brief reference to it in my submission, that of course there would need to be certain thresholds that would need to be met for political parties to attract financing if it is the will of the Commission and the Barbadian people that such financing be drawn from the consolidated fund. So if we consider, for example, that you have in insurance something that's called a deductible, which is a way of saying you have to put in some skin in the game first before we put our skin in the game, that is the kind of model that might be used so that there might be a period within which political parties would need to be active and face some level of election, even if it is a by-election or perhaps a general election, before it begins to attract financing. Again, this is an exploration because we will make a written submission, but I wanted to assure you that we have begun to consider the question of thresholds, the question of how many candidates are going to be fielded in an election, bearing in mind that people are still able to run as independents. That capacity remains. But if you are going to organize as a political party and enjoy some of the benefits and attract some of the financing that may attach to campaign financing, then there's certain thresholds of membership and of candidature or number of candidates and so on that we are exploring as our recommendation. The only thing I would add to what was said before by Mr. Humphrey about the issue of cost is that I think that this forum, the very existence of this commission is helping us all to consider, or helping all Barbadians to consider, what do we want from our governance? What do we want from our members of parliament? I think that if you ask people whether what they want is greater responsiveness to day-to-day issues, and if they are willing to see that financed, that they might tell you yes. I happen to believe, and this is me speaking as Marcia Cattle now, I happen to believe that this question of whether Barbadians want to see greater responsiveness to the day-to-day issues is inextricably linked to the question of the capacity of the public service to so respond. Because obviously, if you ask a question, if a member of a People's Assembly seeks to have something done, then invariably it is some service that is provided by the government or by the state that has to respond. So it takes two hands to clap. So we can't just strengthen People's Assemblies if that is what is decided, but we also arguably have to strengthen the capacity of the public service, whatever that looks like, to be able to respond in a timely way. But I do think that if you ask Barbadians if there is value in a higher degree of responsiveness to some of the day-to-day issues, then they might tell you that there is value. Alongside that, I think that this conversation is calling for us to determine who is a member of parliament? What is the role? How do we want our members of parliament to serve us? Because surely it goes beyond fixing lights on a pastor or calling BWA to send a tanker to Halls Road, which I just had to do. Surely it goes beyond that. Surely it is in the interest of everyone to create space, one, to have issues answered in a timely way, but two, to allow members of parliament to engage on things that matter to people. When I was growing up, my mother often engaged a member of parliament on, and I saw two results as I was a child. One having to do with the flooding that was in St. Clair Bottom, because we cannot walk home from school from Belmont comfortably when it rained because the bottom used to flood. And I saw my mother make strenuous representation on that issue. The other had to do with the question of extracurricular education at the level of the community for young people, and also got response on that issue, so that her member of parliament was able to engage beyond picking up a phone and calling for a service to be done, which arguably others can do, because we have to look at whether this is the best use of the time and skills and space of the MP. We want to make sure that is done. That is not to say we're setting that aside. We want to make sure that is done. People deserve that. But we also want to make sure that people are also able to engage their MPs on issues and governance and policy, and have those interests represented in Parliament and beyond. So I think this is a question for the Barbadian people, this question of cost. Do you see the value in having greater responsiveness? And I think the Barbadian people will answer us very clearly on that, and we should allow them so to do.
So we propose as a party, we said that there should be an increase in to include national MPs, 7 or 9, I said. It could be 7, it could be 9, I think it depends on where we land. But that the people of the country would choose the Prime Minister, but that the Prime Minister should be on the ballot as a national MP, so that everyone in the country votes and determines who's the Prime Minister.
There's another issue which I should like to put to either one of you, or maybe both, or perhaps Ms. Caddo will intervene again. What, in your scenario, is the role of A, people's assemblies, B, constituency MPs, C, national MPs? What would be the distinctions between the functions of these three groups? What would be the areas of overlap, if any? And how would the current concept of representation at the constituency level be elaborated or changed by this three-tiered system which you are proposing?
I just wanted to perhaps bring some comfort to the chairman this evening that the question that you posed has been explored. I don't want us to give the impression that we kind of just woke up with the idea and that there wasn't fulsome debate. So I perhaps wanted to give an idea of what was the nature of that exploration. Certainly, among the concerns was that people elect a constituency MP for a number of reasons, not just because they seem like a nice girl, as Ms. Husbands pointed out. People also elect constituency MPs because we give people the vote. That means we trust them to make a choice with respect to representation. And so people often seek to elect people who can come and line by their shop on a Friday, but who can also fill their eyes with respect to visionary leadership for the community, and I dare say for the country. That Bajans have enjoyed outstanding leaders at every level politically. And so it has become an expectation. And often people, in discussing who they will vote for, they're not just thinking about who they can line with. They're also thinking about, don't get me wrong, they want somebody to line with, but they're also thinking about who can go and speak and represent them. I think sometimes we underestimate the level of political engagement that Barbadians have at the level of policy. And so it was a concern that was raised in our discussion. What are we doing to the role of the constituency MP? That was a consideration. And therefore, because we all in this room and across Barbados have to be concerned with the future of political participation. Who are we attracting to political service? Now, we want to make sure that we attract people who also want to have policy engagement. And that we don't simply carve out and say, well, you are national, you only occupy this very rarefied policy space. And so that was also a concern. The question of whom will you attract to be a constituency MP? Right now, the constituency MP by number is the greatest number of MPs. And so we want to make sure that there's continuity and that we keep attracting people to that role. So the question of how we balance those three, if they are to be balanced and if they are to go forward, did come up. There were those who felt that constituency MPs can be challenged, and I dare say do currently also represent national policy level discussion. And so to what extent would national MPs be required? I will say I have clinics not on Wednesdays but on Thursdays, because I know nobody from cabinet is going to bother me on a Thursday afternoon, and I am free to do so. But I dare say that a lot of constituents also come to you to talk about policy. Before the estimates process started, one of the things that I did was to go on the road and to canvass my constituents about issues that would come up in the estimates, about financing of government programs, because I have nurses that are concerned about issues with nursing. There are people who have policy concerns that they expect their constituency MP to speak to. And to be frank, that is a purview that I enjoy along with the rest. So I just wanted to give the assurance that these things were explored. I am sure that in the written submission, Mr. Humphrey will perhaps flesh them out a little bit more. But I also thought it was fair to the Commission and to the people represented here that we give an idea of what some of the other concerns were before the party considered that it would come to this position.
Envisage, and are you ready to make any suggestion regarding how you could assist those current committees that may have challenges, how you might be able to put proposals to this commission that would allow for the commission's work to be expanded or clarified or further facilitated by having persons who are not in the parliament work with you on, if not all, some select areas to ensure that the work that is before you is in fact conducted.
I think, Mashi, come here.
Forgive me, but I was trying to think of an answer as I walked to the microphone. So Sorry. This might just be me thinking out loud a bit. But what does come to mind is, for example, the question of the Auditor General's report and the question of the role of the Public Accounts Committee. Now, it occurs to me that there is scope in that area of work for partnership with people outside of the Parliament. I know some very well qualified people who are accountants, yes, but also deal with accounting in the realm of public finance and have a considerable amount of experience in that regard. And while we deal with this system that we have, where we have a 30-0 majority, we have to consider how we reconvene the Public Accounts Committee and what does that chairpersonship look like, whether we have a joint chair, one being an independent senator, another being a non-executive member of Parliament, whether we have a joint chair that then draws on some of the expertise of people from outside the Parliament as a standing Public Finance Committee, for example. These are things that are all under consideration. But it seems to me that this could be one of the ways that we give the public some comfort as well, that we are not just regulating ourselves, but that we're using resources outside of Parliament, outside of the executive, to make sure that we are fully transparent and accountable to the satisfaction of the people of Barbados. And I think there's similarly a role for a person in that regard to help explain the Auditor General's report and what it is saying and what it is not saying, because there is also that role. The Auditor General's report has a structure. It must fit that structure and meet that structure. And there perhaps would be a role within this committee system of public accounts to also have a person or individuals who are able to meet the public halfway in understanding some of these issues. So that comes to mind, yes, as one of the potential recommendations. But again, we continue to flesh these out and to write these down for your benefit. To be mindful, first of all, when we, ahead of a general election, the word canvass, as we all know, really means to seek the views of constituents, not to seek votes. So you're canvassing to seek the views of constituents on a rolling basis, right? And so ahead of a general election, you're doing that to get you in good stead so that once you win, if you win, that you can hit the ground running to respond to concerns. Many of us, I know I did have a local manifesto, a constituency manifesto, that said, this is what I commit to doing based on what people have told me, and that is what I measure myself against over the 5 years, and that is what I report against to constituents along with the other things. But I also wanted to give a little bit of a glimpse of what we deal with. So I have a rolling set of concerns that relate to a range of issues. Housing, so NHC, Urban Development Commission, welfare, a range of issues. And these are household level concerns and community level concerns that we keep as a Bible. Now, obviously, I can't report to the people about household level concerns, but I just wanted to let you know that it is not to say that you are elected and then you run away and then you never interact with your constituents again. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know who does. But that you always have these concerns. So the idea of going back to your constituents to get a renewed mandate, you are always back with your constituents because you are always having to manage the ongoing questions that they have. But the only flavor I wanted to put was that an MP is only as effective as the systems of government and governance. Because an MP does not have a direct execution pathway. I cannot execute roads, I cannot execute housing. And so that's why I said in the beginning that all of this question of resourcing MPs to do better, and I agree with job descriptions, by the way, people have to understand what they should expect. But the only way that an MP, the only question the question of resourcing an MP to do better and expect an MP to do better can make sense is if the services of government are also given the wherewithal to do better, because the two work together. Now, we also had explored in our discussions the question of what is the level of accountability, not just of the executive, but of the public service to duly elected members of Parliament. Because we are not just people outside knocking on the door saying, please, people elected us. And should there be some consideration given to having some measure of accountability between the executive and the public service together and the Parliament or the individual members of Parliament. Now, I know that's complex, and it raises all kinds of other questions of interference, granted, but it is something that one has to consider, because if you're going to recall an MP, you got to recall an MP or not recall an MP within the context of what they have the capacity and the power to execute. So let's just be mindful of that. Thanks.